All right, welcome everybody to the Halloween 2016 edition of SIG Service Catalog. I'm your host, Paul Mortuary, and today I would like to switch things up from the last few meetings, and let's talk about what does it mean we've talked a lot about consuming services. Let's talk about producing them. And we are less prepared for this discussion than we were for the last use case discussion. We have no list already. So what I can do is share my screen. Yes, thank you, Doug. There is a existing issue for this in the incubator repo. I can share my screen and we can talk through what's up there. And I will take notes, if you will bear with me. All right, can everybody see the minutes?
A little small, but yeah.
Okay. Let's see. You put that into... No one should feel threatened by this mohawk. It's the friendliest hairdo.
Well, I just noticed Jason's hat, so it seems like he's trying to compete.
That's right.
I can make no recommendations on the wisdom of trying to compete with the pink mohawk. All right. So I just did a very brief brain dump into this comment here. I think there are 3 use cases fundamentally. And the first one, I'll just dump them out there and then we can discuss. The first one is I'm like a SAS provider or someone that runs an existing service broker. And I want to also have my service broker publish services into a Kubernetes service catalog. The second one is, as a Kubernetes user, I want to run my own service broker so that I can participate in that ecosystem. And then the third, which really should have been the second in hindsight, but the third is I want to share, I'm a Kubernetes user, and I have here, I want to run my own service broker so that I can share services in my namespace with users in other namespaces. I don't necessarily think that you would have to run your own service broker to do that, but I wanted to discuss those today. Do we have any opinionated volunteers who would like to speak first?
I'd love to talk about number 2 just so I can understand it a little more. So I guess the scenario is you're a Kubernetes developer, you've built some API, and you want to publish that to what? I think that's probably my first question. Is it to like some master global service catalog list that exists out there? And if so, what are the types of things that I would need to think about, like monetization? Anyway, I maybe you can talk a little bit more about what you're thinking for the number 2 use case.
So the number 2 use case to me is like, and I might be crossing the streams a little bit, but the number 2 use case is I want to run a service in Kubernetes that users of the service broker API can consume that may themselves not be other Kubernetes users. So they may be users of Cloud Foundry, they may be users of another orchestrator that that also uses the service broker API.
So you just have an API that you want to make available to anyone.
I have a service offering of some kind that I want to make available, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not, don't personally know if that was in my head for producer views. I felt more aligned around the producer view being I have a service that I want to share with people at my company. I don't know how that translates to what it means for people outside my company, where I'm actually running a fully productionized service for external users. I mean, just thinking off the top of my head, little things that I would need if I'm running an external service, terms of service agreements that I probably don't need if I'm running something inside my company. So I'd love to get other people's thoughts, but I would love to maybe just solve I have a service that I want to make available to people on my team or people within my company. And that's the producer story that we think is more important.
Yeah, and I'm comfortable striking number 2 for now. I think that if we can do number 3, we can probably do number 2. So, does anybody disagree with focusing on the first and third use cases in this list here, which are using existing service brokers in the catalog and then sharing services across namespaces in Kubernetes?
I have a proposal for another. It's around SAS providers. So if I'm a SAS provider, I want to give clusters the option of exposing my services in their cluster.
So how is that different from number 3?
Actually, from number 1, right?
It could be either, I think.
Yeah, I would have said number 1.
Okay.
So I see it as, I'll address both. I see it as different from number 1 because you may not be an operator of a service broker. You may, as let's say you're, a SAS provider A, you may not have a service broker already. You may have not built one. And as far as number 3 goes, the service would not necessarily exist inside of your cluster and certainly may not necessarily exist inside of a namespace in your cluster. In truth,
I agree with Aaron. The wording on the first one is a little weird that it assumes a service broker exists. I mean, can we just generalize it to say, use service broker to get additional addressable market for my service? And, if you have one, that's nice.
I tell you what I'm going to do is I'm going to dump these use cases 3 into the agenda document. And I will put the link to this into the chat and we can suggest changes.
I'd like to start backwards and start with number 3 for a sec. Just out of curiosity, when you wrote that, were you assuming that the equivalent of a service instance create would create another instance of the service in you as the service owner's namespace, or it would create something inside the consumer's namespace?
These are all black box use cases.
Okay.
And I will disambiguate that.
Okay. So then number 3 really focuses more on how do I create a service broker?
I think in number 3, I would probably rephrase maybe to be more along the lines of, I want to use services to separate concerns within my own environment. So, I'll factor my solutions in a way that can be maintained by different teams or something.
I would agree with that, with one small modification being that we disambiguate the word service there. So specifically, if I want to create a thing in Kubernetes and expose it as a Kubernetes service, I would like that to be shareable in the service catalog API.
Okay. I tell you what, can I just get a show? I'm having like a meta moment here, and I'm wondering, do folks believe that there are more than one that there is more than one use case for producing a service. Okay, I only see 4 windows with this goofy view that I have. I see Aaron's thumb going up. Anybody else? Is there only one producing use case, or are there multiple, and how are they divided?
I would think there'd be multiple ones. I think there would be, there's sort of kind of the obvious one to me is the white box and the black box cases. And I also think that I want to go ahead and take, I think this is maybe what Aaron was saying, maybe not, but it would just, hey, I want to go ahead and play in this new world, but I have some stuff that is already running, but I'm going to go and start taking advantage of those. So I should be able to seamlessly bring things in so that I can, maybe that's what you meant, Aaron, maybe not, but that's what I'm thinking is there's going to be a mode where stuff's going to be running that's being spun up and everything else like that. And then there's some stuff that is being consumed and operated on using this catalog, but they should seamlessly play together.
So I tell you what, why don't we start from the ground up, and I'm going to strike these 2 things from I'll add more. So starting over, let's formulate the use cases. I would suggest for the first one, and I'm going to type this into the notes, and folks can make suggestions in Google Docs or verbally, that as an operator of a Kubernetes service, I want to share that service in the catalog and allow users of other namespaces to use my service. I guess this "and" is really more of a so that users of other namespaces can use my service. Any thoughts or comments about this one?
I think it looks good.
Do you want to be even more anal and say, do you want them to be able to use your service via the service catalog, the service broker service catalog, as opposed to strictly using the existing Kubernetes mechanisms to possibly span network namespaces, even though that doesn't exist today?
I would kind of like to leave it here because I think as we refine these, we'll probably split this into a couple different ones. Yeah, I guess I'd prefer to leave it the way it is for now, unless folks have a really strong opinion.
That's fine.
Okay. Let me suggest another use case as an operator of an external service. I want to share that service in the catalog so that users of Kubernetes can use it. Questions, comments?
One question on this one is, as an operator of an external service, I want to enable a cluster operator so that they can share the service. Because I think there's a question of like who did what and who's authorized to do what that's around in that use case.
Yeah, sure. So does that really apply to both of these use cases?
Probably.
Okay.
I'd agree there. We're kind of operating here on two subtypes of service producers. There's the person who actually built the service. Additionally, there's potentially a party who wants to pull in their catalog. And we may be considering both as producers right now.
Okay. Jason, what was the verbiage that you used? I want to enable my service to be listed in the catalog.
Yeah, so it was like, as an operator of an external service, I want to enable a cluster operator to be able to share. So there's the second one. I can actually just throw the language in there.
Yeah, go for it.
All right, so I added that as a comment.
Let's see. Okay, I resolved that one. I think if in the state that is in here now, the difference between these two is the implication that in the first one, the operator is the party that's exposing this service into the catalog. And in the second one, obviously the cluster operator is doing it. Do we think that that is something that is accurate? It should be retained, or should we edit the first one?
I don't have a strong feelings.
Okay. So I think these are fine use cases to start with. This is significantly easier, probably, or smaller problem set than the consumption side and the mechanics of the catalog. So since we have about 40 minutes left, we could continue talking through these and exploring like what we think the experience is like, or we could move on to, or we could circle back to the other use cases. I feel like this is progress, but there's something that I can't put my finger on that is probably, or that is missing about it, I guess.
Are people just use cased out?
Well, I'd like to dig a little deeper then, because I feel like the use cases are fairly high level. And like I kind of said earlier, I feel like they kind of boil down to, I want to create a service broker. So I wouldn't mind kind of brainstorming a little, and a little bit is for my own selfish reasons. I like to sort of understand a little bit more about Kubernetes and what do people think would be a Kubernetes thing we can do to make life easier for people to create a service broker? Are there existing patterns inside Kubernetes for doing this, or is it completely wide open and anything we come up with to help people create their own service broker is completely new?
So that's a good question. I personally, I think that, so I think it's reasonable to facilitate sharing Kubernetes services via service brokers because, one, service broker API already exists. It's obviously not perfect, but using it lets us avoid creating something new, which I would prefer, not to do unless we had a very strong reason to do so. What does everybody else think about that?
I mean, my thought, and I don't know if this is where Doug was going, is like it seems like a pretty big cliff to say I have a service that I want to share with people to now I need to go and implement a service broker. And I don't know if it's worth brainstorming, but like, you know, do we envision something like a wizard where somebody wants to share something and they click the first thing that says, yes, what would you like to name your service? And then you want to say, well, for each new user, do you want to provision a new, you know, set of resources? If so, link off to the Helm chart in order to do that. I'm kind of just hoping that maybe it's not such a start from scratch. I need to build a service broker by myself, and maybe there's ways we can make that creation process a bit easier.
Yeah, so like one thing that seems like it would definitely be a possibility is that we could build a skeletal service broker that had the bits for the web server and implemented the different REST endpoints that the service broker API, expects there to be. But then to fulfill each of those endpoints, calls out to a user-provided entry point, so that to write your own service broker, you can take this image and add an extra layer to the file system that has the entry points for the different API calls.
Right. That's actually what I was thinking of in my comment, but I wasn't sure if there was something a little better that we can provide to someone other than just sort of a sample or a template. But that obviously is it's a nice starting point.
Yeah, I don't know what the right answer is, but I would like to see something more than just a bunch of code files that they have to go and build out. I'm trying to think, like, does anyone know of any API marketplaces out there and what their onboarding experience is like? Maybe there's some examples out there that we can borrow from.
Well, there's Heroku.
Hey, yeah, in similar space, there's Mesosphere Universe, which is something we could take a look at. But I actually think the DAIS proposal that showed the prototype that they were working on is sort of points in the right direction. You know, I think the broker is going to be tied more than anything else to the deployment technology, I think. And there's some additional issues like provisioning of identities and whatnot that need to be worked out maybe on an app-by-app basis. But there's a separate discussion in the SIG network and maybe soon in SIG auth about the service mesh, which could potentially provide some sort of app-independent authentication and authorization mechanism. And we've been discussing how to automatically provision things like TLS credentials for apps deployed onto Kubernetes generally. So I think there are some primitives in Kubernetes that are needed even if you're not sharing your application with other applications on Kubernetes, but you're just running an application and you want TLS credentials or something like that. So I think there's some general mechanisms there. And then if people build a Helm service broker and an OpenShift template service broker and a deployment manager service broker and an Ansible service broker or whatever, then if you have some deployment templates that will work with that deployment mechanism, you could potentially just register a different repository and use an existing off-the-shelf service broker. Like that would be, I think, completely reasonable. If you're running a service already in Kubernetes and you just want to share across namespaces, and this is something that if you're not running constrained network policies or authorization rules, it's something that just works today. And a service broker shouldn't strictly be necessary. I think the main things it would be necessary for would be if you were running with restrictive rules to poke holes in whatever firewalls or whatever obstacles you put in the way, or to provision credentials on a per user basis, or provision a sandbox if you need a new database table or a new directory and a file server, things of that nature. So I think there may be some categories of more specialized service brokers that are needed for some of these kinds of applications that people could build, and then also potentially piggyback on those. So, you know, I'm not too worried about this problem. Once we start with developing an ecosystem of these service brokers, then I think they will be pretty reusable, even potentially without code modification.
Yeah, I would like to see. I think having a broker that's usable without modification is a good goal. I think that's probably not something that we can necessarily hope to achieve in V1, but it's something to be tracking towards. What I wonder, I was thinking about this over the weekend, is I was trying to think about sort of the continuum of complexity for responses to, or actions that needed to happen in response to provision and bind calls. And I think the absolute simplest is of the form, you have like a Kubernetes service. You don't care about tenancy. You don't really have any need to differentiate credentials across users, or maybe you don't have credentials that are required, period. With the most complex being, you do have some provisioning that needs to happen. You have to provision new credentials for new tenants, et cetera, et cetera. And walking along that continuum, I very quickly get to the point in my own head where I'm like, okay, I do need a service broker for this.
Yeah, I'm not saying that service brokers are not needed. I'm just saying I think you know, some less than, say, dozen service broker implementations will satisfy a lot of needs. You know, for SAS providers, I don't know how much commonality there is among SAS provider sort of provisioning and binding protocols, so that remains to be seen. But you know, Google Cloud announced a Cloud Foundry service broker recently for some of its more popular services. I would love to be able to just use that in Kubernetes to get Cloud SQL or BigQuery or whatever it is, and have similar ones on Amazon. You know, if it becomes commonplace that cloud providers provide service broker API for their existing services, then that will just be something that users don't have to worry about. They'll get that for free when they run Kubernetes on whichever cloud they're trying to use.
I think there's two vectors here. One is what was mentioned earlier, kind of a skeleton service broker. And such a service broker could be used to create, such a skeleton could be used to create a broker for whatever cloud provider. Fairly simple. All you have to do is just decide what provision means for that thing and then implement it. But on the other side, Brian, I think you may have alluded to this. We could achieve a lot, especially for the use case number one, as the operator of an existing Kubernetes service. We could achieve that in most cases by doing what we called command mode in our demo earlier. Maybe that was 3 SIGs ago. Basically, command mode just executes a command inside of an image you give it. And that command can be a script, or it can be whatever, something that you have that's probably legacy code. And that decides what provision and what bind and unbind and so on means.
But couldn't that command mode be implemented with, with a service broker front end on it? So, I mean, I know in your demo you sort of had it as a standalone separate thing, but it seems like it would be trivial to actually implement such a service broker that was generic and could be used by anybody, that it took an image and a command line or script or whatever.
Yeah, that's an option too. Effectively, they're the same thing from a producer standpoint, in that you give something an image and you tell the person who created the image that there's a specification for what the command that will be run inside that image will do, and what it must return, and what standard in looks like, what standard out looks like, so on and so forth.
Yeah, that's what I imagined as well, Martin.
It helps if you're not muted. I was doing a verbal +1 to what Aaron just described. So let me take the temperature of the group. Do we feel like there's any more fruitful discussion that can happen on this now? Or should we move on to another topic? Doug, you had some concerns about specificity. How are you feeling?
I'm okay.
Okay.
I just wanted to get some brainstorming going. That was it.
Yeah.
I did have a question, and this might be a naive question, but when I'm trying to share this service, do I have to have a service broker running inside my cluster in order to do these provisioning calls, or can that service broker live somewhere else?
Well, so I don't think there's any reason that the service broker has to live within your cluster. I think so. When I imagine production environments that use the service catalog, I see like a mix of external service brokers that don't live in the cluster, and then service brokers that do live in the cluster. And one thing that I'll call out that I've talked to some folks about, but I don't think it's been brought up in the SIG, is there's also a question of making like a seed list of brokers that are known to work with the Kubernetes catalog and curating that list. And is that a function of the SIG? Is that something that organizations handle for themselves? Do we offer any guidance on it, et cetera, et cetera? Does that answer your question though, Weston?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's just an endpoint at the end of the day. I didn't know if there were any restrictions or best practices around that. It sounds like it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, I think I think it's better if it doesn't matter.
Another question, and I don't know if we can want to discuss this, but like if I'm creating a service broker and I want to register it as part of a catalog experience, what metadata am I going to be publishing, and what schema am I going to be using to describe said metadata? Do we have anything out there?
Yeah, so there is the schema is dictated by the service broker API right now. Like if you're using a Cloud Foundry service broker, that the API spec dictates like the content and structure of the response, and that part of that API and response messages include metadata about the service.
I'm just going to split hairs for 1 second. Doesn't need to be addressed right now. I wanted to mention that I don't consider the security model of the Cloud Foundry Broker API to be good enough to recommend for publicly facing brokers. This is coming from a place of never having deployed Cloud Foundry for a production app, however. And I also have no experience running a publicly facing Cloud Foundry service broker.
Mm-hmm.
It's a concern of mine, and that's all, nothing more.
Did you have specific concerns you wanted to call out?
Just that it's just basic auth. I think the least we should do is enforce basic auth over TLS. I actually don't know if the service broker API specifies that it must be over HTTPS. But if we do keep the basic auth, I think it needs to at least be that for purposes of the service catalog API.
Okay, that's a good point. Let's see.
So Aaron, or anybody else, if you'd like, you can also join the service broker working group that we have and over in the CNCF land. Actually, I guess it's not really CNCF, it's sort of in between, where we're looking at making some modifications to the Cloud Foundry specification. So we welcome input over there too, but you're not the only one that's had some concerns about the security of the API.
Cool. Can you put a link to some information on that working group in the chat?
Yeah, I'll try to track it down, but yeah, I'll put it in there.
Cool, thank you.
Yep.
One thing that I've considered as you start thinking about a broader economy of service brokers is who gets to name what and where. So if you've got like an off-the-shelf remote service broker endpoint and it exposes plans A, B, and C, or services A, B, and C with plans X, Y, and Z, name collisions for those service plan pair thingers come into question kind of across the board.
So if memory serves, I believe that the question of naming collisions isn't handled so much in the spec as identity of services and plans is based on their GUIDs. So each service and plan has a GUID, and that is the material part of that thing's identity. And if anybody can correct me on this, I would love to know if I'm wrong. My reading of the docs indicates that name collisions seem like they're fine, but GUID collisions are not.
Sorry, I wasn't paying attention. Name collisions and what scope?
So the question is, is there any mechanism to prevent naming collisions amongst services and plans? And I was saying that the material.
What does name mean in this context?
I don't want to speak for Jason, but I took it to mean like the display name of a service or a plan.
Okay, so I mean, in general, and as you mentioned, for UIDs, those are generated in such a way that with high probability they're unique across all space and time, and names within other names, resource names, if you want them to be unique, we use them as the primary key in etcd, and there can be only one at any given time, but that's the fully qualified name, including namespace if it's a namespace resource, and cluster if it's a cluster local resource.
So this is, in addition to what you've said, Brian, there is some mapping or disambiguation that needs to be done once we get further into this to say, so for example, the coordinates that are passed along in the Cloud Foundry Service Broker API don't match one-to-one with the types of coordinates that we have in Kubernetes. So there is an organization, and then within that organization, a space, where space aligns fairly well to namespace, but organization is some intermediate thing that is higher level than what our namespaces would be in Kubernetes, that encompasses multiple ones, but is like a higher level of hierarchy that we don't have in Kubernetes. So there is some task, which is figuring out how do Kubernetes coordinates map into this API, and how you would fill out that piece of a request, API request to a Cloud Foundry broker. Does that make sense to folks?
Okay.
So I guess it's also following Doug. It says the service catalog or the service broker working group discussed federated naming at all, or just GUIDs are it.
We have discussed removing the CF-isms from the API. There is a pull request for it. It hasn't merged. I feel like the org and space coordinates are a CF-ism. Doug, do you happen to remember whether that pull request addresses those things? I know that we talked about it on the last working group meeting.
Yeah, that PR just talks about pulling out the organ space stuff. It doesn't get into the whether names or have to be globally unique or just the GUIDs and stuff. And I honestly, I can't remember the scope of the name. I'd have to go back and double check the spec.
Okay.
But I do know that GUIDs have to be unique because that's how Cloud Foundry references everything inside of its internal data structures.
One question just for a CF broker operator. Are they generating that GUID when they generate the service name and client pairs, or are they coming with the broker off the shelf, or how do these things get birthed?
I think it depends on which flow you're talking about. Say, for example, the create service instance flow. It actually gets created by the client of the flow. In other words, Cloud Foundry platform in this case, when he talks to service broker, he tells the service broker what GUID to use. And I believe from a historical perspective, the reason they did that is to make the call idempotent. That way, if you could replay it and be guaranteed that you're not going to be creating a new one every single time, you're going to get the same thing.
Yeah, and those
the services inside makes sense. I'm more interested in the V2 catalog endpoint and all the GUIDs in there.
Yeah, so those GUIDs are also used to track changes when a broker is updated in the Cloud Foundry marketplace. So one interesting thing that differs is that you can rename service brokers in the Cloud Foundry marketplace. That does not seem like something that is a goal for us, but there is some ability to rename brokers, and I believe also that you can rename, that you can change the display name for a service as long as you keep the GUID constant. Which is another area that seems like it probably doesn't map exactly into the Kubernetes world. So I tell you what, I think everybody's kind of thinking and processing right now. I will make a pull request to the incubator repo after this to add the producing use cases to the use case document. And while we have this kind of lull in the cadence of this meeting, let me also say for those who are going to attend the face-to-face, I think it would be good homework to read the existing use cases document, get familiar with it, and if you have any suggestions, feel free to open a pull request or create an issue if you have a question or find something that you think needs to be addressed that isn't currently addressed in the document. So I'm hearing a lull continuing now. We have 12 minutes left. I wonder, do folks have anything else they want to discuss? Or have we brought up enough questions and uncertainty that perhaps it's better to adjourn and we will pick this up in Boulder? Any opinions?
Did we agree? Are we starting at 9 o'clock each day?
Good question.
Yes, that's correct. 9 o'clock. This is Seth.
Okay, hey Seth, and huge question here. Should we eat before we get there? Or are you providing breakfast?
We have snacks of varying types, like Cliff Bars, in the office. So it depends on what you're used to for breakfast. For me, that is breakfast. For some, that may not be enough.
Okay, no, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay, Seth, is there anything that you want to call out while we're on this subject?
Yeah, I think. Yeah, you bet. You and I had chatted about sort of how we want to get people kind of aware of the same domain that's been discussed over the course of many SIG service catalog meetings. And at least I and a few others would like to see demos of the service brokers that were presented a while ago. So one of those was from the Google team. I think Weston, you and Vile presented that one.
That was Brendan, but yep, we could do that.
It'd be awesome to just see what state it's at now.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that'd be great.
And then it might lead to some good discussion points about like what you've learned watching the use cases progress in this SIG. And then Aaron, I obviously have already talked to you about demoing kind of what the data side of the service broker has been up to and what we've been changing due to conversations within the SIG already. Other than that, I'm trying to come up with awesome icebreakers so that all you people still with Halloween sugar comas can talk after a day of travel in the morning on Wednesday.
Fair enough, fair enough. I will also try to bring my best icebreaker game to this meeting.
Is it literally ice breaking?
It could be. Like, we're talking karate chops to like break blocks of ice, right?
That would be a different experience that'd be new.
Hey guys, Dan here. I'm new to this the SIG. I've attended a couple times, just listening in mostly, and tried not to interrupt. Just curious what the high level plan is. Sounds like you guys are meeting in Boulder. What's the strategy, time frame for implementing anything? Next steps, like from a high level perspective.
So I think that's something that we're probably going to try to coalesce on in the meeting, Dan. I couldn't offer any real timeline at this moment. I would like to agree on a scope for V1 that we think is achievable in maybe a couple of months, 2 to 3 months. And my gut tells me that if we can get agreement on use cases and on the mechanics of the API, that implementing that API and those mechanics will be far less effort than the initial agreement was. It's my general feeling on software projects. So I'll let anybody else speak for themselves, but that's kind of where I'm at right now.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. Do you plan on using mostly the Cloud Foundry bits since they're open source and they've been provided and you guys are collaborating anyways, or is there still some discussion around that?
Yeah, so I think that we've agreed in the SIG so far that the Cloud Foundry model is like they've done a good enough job that if you look at their model, it makes sense, right? And it doesn't seem like it's rocket science, which probably means that it took quite a bit of effort to refine to get into that state. So the advantage of using the Cloud Foundry Service Broker API as at least one supported backend API is that it, one, already exists, two, has an ecosystem behind it, and I think that it's good for expediency not to have to invent something new, especially when there is an existing effort to evolve that API that some of the folks in this group are already working on. I do think that we have to be able to support different backend APIs. Like, I think that we should assume that eventually the working group will introduce a backward incompatible change that means that the users of that API will have to adapt their existing implementations, and that the folks that are implementing things like Service Catalog and the Cloud Foundry Cloud Controller will have to differentiate their handling of things according to the backend version of the protocol or version of the API that each particular broker they want to use uses. And there are parts of the problem space that aren't really covered by the Service Broker API. Like, the Service Broker API is necessarily black box. I think there's a fairly strong interest in the group for doing white box in Kubernetes, but we have been attempting to keep the problem space as narrow as possible to decide on like what the right nucleus for the API and the other kind of fundamental questions in the problem space are. Does that make sense?
Yep, sounds good. Thank you.
Cool. All right, we got about 5 minutes left. The floor is open if folks would like to speak. Otherwise, we can end it here and pick this up in a couple days. I would suggest a meeting tomorrow or ask if anybody is interested in doing so, but I will be traveling, so I won't be able to attend, more likely than not.
A little public service announcement. A few of us, and I think Paul too, are going to hit up a Colorado Avalanche game as a fun little icebreaker for the Tuesday night. And we have one extra ticket if anyone wants to join. If you do, just hit me up on Slack.
All right. Well, going in 3, 2, 1. Sounds like that's it. Thank you, everybody, for attending. I hope you all have a spooktacular Halloween. And everybody try to stay alive until we meet in Boulder. Be safe and have a good night.
Thanks, everybody.